Hello and welcome to episode 16 of Lex Out Loud, world building for science fiction. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. I'm working on my third novel, my first science fiction novel, and I'm taking you along with me for the ride. In season 1, I'm exploring world building in depth. So welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to the show. So great to be speaking with you again. Today, I'm going to do my best to answer some of your questions that you've submitted about the setting. So I really want to thank everyone who's submitted questions. I really appreciate it. They're actually a huge help in helping me to get thinking about different aspects of the setting. There's just so much involved with building a setting. It's very easy to just overlook things. So your feedback and your questions are really invaluable to me in helping me to cover as much of the setting as possible and help me to find any things I might have missed or aspects I've overlooked. I also want to thank the patrons for your support of the show. Really appreciate the patrons. Couldn't do it without you. And it's a huge help. So thank you to all the patrons. And if you're not a patron, maybe think about it. Check it out. It's a huge help in getting the show out and being able to do this. And finally, I also while I'm thanking people, I want to thank everyone who participates in our Discord server. I just really enjoy interacting with you all, and we have a lot of great discussions. We share a lot of really great information, and it's all really super helpful to me to help me flesh out my ideas and to just stay motivated and interested and excited in what I'm doing. It's always helpful to know that people are interested in what I'm doing and to have people to bounce ideas off of and all that good stuff. And yeah, we share things that we learn. And some of you have been sharing some great things from the news that I haven't seen that's really informative. And there's just so much exciting stuff going on in science and technology and space exploration right now that there's always things I find out about that I didn't know about that was even happening. So thank you to everyone who participates in the Discord. I really enjoy all of you, and I really value the interactions that we have. And if you're not part of the Discord, please join us there. Everyone's free to join. You don't have to be a patron to join our server, and you can hang out with me and the other listeners and talk about whatever you want to talk about. And yeah, we have a lot of fun there. And I'd really love to see more people involved in the Discord. There are a few people that are pretty active that I recognize that I speak with in there on the regular, but more is always merrier, as they say. All right, so this is actually only the day after I recorded episode 15. So the patrons that have access, that get early access to the episodes, probably have a pretty good feel for what my production schedule is like. The rest of you, not so much, because a lot of the episodes I produce ahead of time so they can come out fairly regularly. So it can seem, if you're not a patron that has early access, it can seem like I just do an episode every week. But that actually often isn't the case. Sometimes weeks go by that I don't do an episode. And then sometimes I'll do quite a few episodes in pretty short order. And it just kind of depends on where I'm at in my process and what kind of time I have and what I have to talk about. So as I talked about a little bit in the last episode, I pretty much at the end of my world building, and I've actually started working on some character and plot stuff. And so I actually have things about that I want to talk about on the show. But in the effort to keep this a little more organized, I'm going to try to get through the world building content that I have planned first before I get into the new character stuff. So I'm I'm really trying to bang this stuff out in short order so I can get through it before I kind of lose the thread of what I've been doing with building characters and things like that, because I really want to share that stuff with you. But I feel like if I go and record that stuff now, I'm never going to come back and do this world building stuff, because once I've moved on, I tend to not want to go backwards. So I think in the interest of getting this stuff addressed as much as possible, I'm just going to try to do it now and get through it now. And then I can hopefully get these last few world building episodes done fairly quickly so that I can get into the character stuff while it's still fresh in my mind. All right. So for the past few episodes, I've been putting out the call for listener questions about my setting that I'm developing. And the original thought, I was just thinking of the whole 20 questions thing. So that was kind of the original idea, is like, oh, I'll gather questions until I have 20, and then I'll start answering them. Well, right away, things started going differently than I had originally thought, because the whole 20 questions thing, that's like for short fire, short answer, quick fire, short answer. I don't know how what I'm trying to say, but that works for questions that have short answers, right? Like a one sentence answer. And right away, I found that the questions that you all were submitting to me were not those kinds of questions. They weren't questions that I could just give a one sentence answer, at least not and really do the question justice and really answer it to the best of my ability. And then the other thing was I wasn't getting that many questions. Like, I mean, I've gotten quite a few questions, but nowhere near 20. So the idea for this kind of has shifted from the whole 20 questions thing to just fewer questions. But the questions you all are sending me are fairly in-depth questions. So it worked out well. And even if I had 20 short fire questions, I doubt I could get through 20 in an episode the way I like to expound on things. So yeah, it's probably a good thing that there weren't that many questions. As it is, there are more questions than I'm going to be able to get through in an episode. And I'm not sure how long it's going to take to go through these. And also, there are some questions that some of you have asked, especially I'm thinking of our listener Helga in the Discord. Asked some very good, very thought-provoking questions about societies and cultures and things like that I don't know if I'm ready to answer all of those yet, because they're things I really have to think about. So I'm not answering these in the order they were received. I'm more answering them in the order of how well I can answer them. So the ones I'm starting out with today were the questions that I either already had an answer for, or it didn't take me long to come up with an answer for. And then there are other questions, like a lot of the ones that Helga submitted, that are getting put off because they're either questions I don't know the answer to yet, or they're questions that I'm still thinking about and I'm not to my final answer yet. I'm still working it out. So if you're someone that submitted a question early and it's not being answered, that's why, is because it's one that requires a little more thought from me. But I do hope to answer them all eventually. But we'll start with the low-hanging fruit, which are the questions that are either just simpler to answer or are just things that happen to be questions about things I've thought about more. All right, so the first one we'll talk about today is a question that came from Kaigwar. I'm still not sure if I'm saying that right, but we'll say that I am for now. And Kaigwar asks, what's something that you thought was pure science fantasy until realizing it is way closer to possible than you thought? So yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, the immediate answer that comes to mind to that is space elevators. I done quite a bit of research in the space elevators years ago when I first started having some of the ideas for the setting, which was 10, 12 years ago, something like that. And during part of that time, I was actually in school. I was going to school for biotechnology, and I don't even remember what the class was now. But one of my classes, I had to do a presentation, and I did a presentation on space elevators. I don't remember what class it was and how that was relevant to biotechnology. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it wasn't a biology class. I don't remember. But so I did quite a bit of research into them then. And so I knew that they were impossible to do on Earth without carbon nanotube technology. And even with that, it we don't know for sure that we could do it. And I knew that carbon nanotube technology on the scale that you would need for a space elevator was way in the future. And that was the case years ago when I did the presentation, like 10 years ago or whatever it was. So I knew some basic things about space elevators and kind of where we were at in developing the technology. So all along, I was thinking that space elevators were my my freebie, my one magical thing. Which I don't think this is something I've talked about on the show, and I don't honestly know if this is my own idea or something I've gleaned from someone else or somewhere else. I don't know where this comes from, but I have this idea in my head of it's kind of a little rule for myself when it comes to writing, at least for this setting, is I'm allowed to have one thing that's a hand wave or a Clark Tech or magic or one freebie, I'm allowed to do one thing that maybe isn't as plausible as everything else. If I have to, just to make the story work or to do something that I want to do. And I mean, I think this is my own idea. I don't remember hearing anyone talk about this. If you know of anyone that's talked about this, let me know. And maybe it is something that someone like Brandon Sanderson talked about years ago, and I heard it and internalized it and then forgot about him talking about it. That's completely possible. But, I've talked quite a bit on this show about about the differences between space opera and mundane science fiction, and why I'm trying to stay in the realm of mundane science fiction, and I'm trying not to do space opera. I've talked a lot about that. And this whole like limiting myself to one freebie is part of that, because I think about something like Star Trek. Like I just read a really cool article yesterday about science fiction fantasy or science fantasy, or what the author was calling space fantasy, which I actually prefer of the possible terms. So let's call it space fantasy. But comparing space fantasy with science fiction, and also sort of comparing space opera with kind of hard science fiction. I think the author of the article was kind of using space fantasy more to refer to space opera as opposed to what I consider to be science fiction fantasy, which is more like something like maybe like Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, where to me, science fiction fantasy is a fantasy story that uses all of the tropes of fantasy and to all appearances is a fantasy story, but is built on a foundation that's based on science fiction, or based on a science fiction setting. So, for instance, the Book of the New Sun is a setting where, I mean, I don't know that it's Earth. I don't remember It's been a while since I read those books. I don't remember if it was ever stated whether or not this was Earth or what, but let's say it is for sake of discussion. The setting was far, far in the future of Earth, where there had been this time where Earth had been, like a science fiction setting with all this super advanced technology, but then civilization fell. And now it was much more a fantasy setting. People didn't have understanding of technology anymore, but there were still these remnants of technology left, and some of them still worked, some of them didn't. Some of them were used by people, others weren't. So it was kind of a fantasy story on the stage of like a post-apocalyptic sci-fi world, or apocalypse that ended a sci-fi world, and now there's a fantasy world left. So to me, that kind of thing is sci-fi fantasy. Or something else I would qualify as sci-fi fantasy is like the Marvel, like the Thor movies, where there are some kind of science fiction elements thrown in here and there, but it's really just fantasy. It's not even trying to be sci-fi. Now, contrast that with, say, Star Wars, which I would not call Star Wars science fiction fantasy. I would just call it space opera. Because even though Star Wars, I think is a fantasy in that it uses, all the fantasy tropes and way more fantasy tropes than sci-fi tropes. And it's not really science fiction in the sense that it doesn't do anything with science or explore scientific ideas. It's not representing our future or any future. It's actually supposedly way in the past. So by all the really standard definitions, it's not really science fiction. The only thing that makes it seem like science fiction is it takes place in space with spaceships and things like that. But still, I would not call it science fiction fantasy, because it is not presented as a fantasy. The people in Star Wars use technology. They're aware of technology. They understand technology. It's not a fantasy setting. It's not a medieval type setting at all. So I would call Star Wars just straight up fantasy, or space fantasy, as this author called it, or I would call it space opera, but I wouldn't call it science fiction fantasy. So I don't think that space opera and science fiction fantasy are necessarily the same thing, and indeed they're usually not. So now Star Trek is an example of something that, although it is space opera, although it does have a lot of fantastical elements, especially the new Discovery season is really going into the fantasy end of the pool, it is still science fiction. It is still explores scientific ideas. It is set in our future. It is attempting to show what our future might look like. So those are all trappings of science fiction. It also serves as social commentary, which is also another big thing in science fiction. So it is very much science fiction, even though it is also very much space opera, which space opera is a kind of science fiction. And just to muddy the water even further, all this ultimately or originally came from fantasy. So the earliest works of what we consider science fiction now were at the time considered fantasy. So I think it's very accurate to say that sci-fi, science fiction, is a subgenre of fantasy. And then, space opera is a subgenre of science fiction. So a subgenre of a subgenre. And hard science fiction is a subgenre of science fiction. Now, sci-fi fantasy, I would say, is a subgenre of fantasy, just as science fiction itself is. So I would not actually put sci-fi fantasy under the science fiction umbrella in the taxonomy, if you will. I would put it under fantasy, but it would be before sci-fi split off from fantasy, if that makes sense. Anyway, wow, that's a huge tangent. But anyway, getting back to Star Trek. So Star Trek is science fiction, but it's space opera. And so if you think about Star Trek, and if you think about these freebies I'm talking about, or, moments where you're going to disregard science, or you're going to disregard plausibility for the needs of the story or the plot or whatever you want to do, Star Trek has lots of those. It's easy to list a lot of these things like warp drive, transporters, inertial dampeners, gravity plating, which is how they get their artificial gravity, all the various types of time travel they do through all the Star Trek shows and movies, and on and on and on and on. There's numerous examples of these kind of freebies where, there's not really much, if any, scientific justification for it, but it's something that they did for whatever reason, for story reasons. So there's a lot of those, right? Like I just named like 6 of them or whatever. So one of the ways that I'm trying to stay out of the space opera arena and stay within the mundane sci-fi arena is to only allow at most one of those in my setting. I can't have as many as I want, like Star Trek does. Even The Expanse, which I would love to call The Expanse mundane science fiction, but it's really not. A lot of people online seem to think that The Expanse is hard sci-fi, which it's not, and the authors have said it's not, and it's very obviously not. But it's tempting because The Expanse does make so many efforts towards realism that you don't see in things like Star Trek, and it is a much nearer future than what Star Trek is. I mean, Star Trek actually isn't set that far in the future, but it should be. It should be way in the future than it is if you look at the technology they have. But The Expanse has the Epstein drive, also has the whole proto-molecule thing, because mundane science fiction does not involve extraterrestrials of any kind. So right there are two freebies that The Expanse has. If we were going to call The Expanse mundane science fiction, which it's really not, then they have 2 freebies. They have the Epstein drive and they have the proto-molecule. They have alien evidence of the existence of aliens. And there's other things. I'm not even going to get into the social and biological liberties that they take that you could really question. Now, in my mind, that's enough that I would not say that The Expanse is mundane science fiction. Maybe part of the first few episodes before the proto-molecule is introduced, you could maybe argue that that's mundane science fiction, but they're still using the Epstein drive, which isn't remotely possible. So it's really space opera. So, I didn't want that to happen with my book, which I'm not saying the authors of The Expanse set out to write a mundane science fiction and failed to do that. I'm sure their goal or their intent was to write a space opera all along. I'm not trying to say that. But for me, as someone who enjoys The Expanse, looking at it and looking at the ways that it is not a mundane science fiction, I realized that the main thing was there were too many of these liberties taken, too many of these freebies. So I thought, well, maybe a rule of thumb is I can have one. And maybe if I have one thing that maybe stretches plausibility a little bit, if that's the only thing, then it can still feel like mundane sci-fi. It can still be relatable and realistic and all those things that I'm shooting for. So all of that to say that all along, I thought my one thing was going to be the space elevator. I thought that was going to be my one freebie because I thought, I don't want this to be numerous centuries in the future or thousands of years in the future. I don't want to be as far in the future as what Star Trek should be. I want this to be more an immediate future, but I also want space elevators. So that might be something I have to hand wave, take a little artistic license and just say, hey, somehow we figured out a way to make these work with this level of technology. So I'm sure everyone's forgotten what Kygor's question was now after all that rambling about. So his question was there something that I thought was pure science fantasy until realizing it was way closer to possible? And yeah, it is a space elevator. And it's not that is science fantasy. It's just, I thought it would be way further in the future than maybe it will be. So much so that I thought I was going to be kind of fudging a bit, saying that they exist in the time period that my story exists. However, I've since done a lot of research into space elevators and have learned that we could theoretically be building one or have one built here on Earth, as well as Mars and the Moon, within 60 years from now, which right now I'm thinking my story takes place about 200 years in the future. So actually thinking that we have a space elevator on Earth in 200 years isn't a stretch at all. If anything, it maybe even likely will be much sooner than that. So that was really surprising to me. So now I'm thinking my one gimme might be the whole graphene thing, although that I also think is not that far away, considering just how quickly graphene is advancing right now and how quickly 3D printing is advancing and AI and robotics and all these things. It may not even be a gimme either. So I may be able to set my story in 200 years and have these graphene cylinders and have space elevators, and it's all completely plausible and realistic, which would make me super happy. But yeah, that was a surprise to me. That was not what I thought. I thought space elevators were much more unrealistic, and even these huge orbitals were much more unrealistic. And I was very surprised to see the orbitals, the ones made of titanium, we could make theoretically now. We have the technology to do it. It's just, it would be extremely expensive, especially considering if we're bringing materials up from Earth using rockets. I mean, doing it that way, it probably would be impossible just because there's no way you could launch that many rockets. But once we have a space elevator on the moon, it will be very, very easy and cheap to get materials that we mine and refine on the moon from the moon to Earth orbit, and from there to build these structures. So, I mean, that's not that far out at all. I mean, I may even see some of this in my lifetime, which would be amazing. So yeah, to answer Kaigor's question, that the space elevators were a big one. That is not science fantasy at all. And I talked about this in previous shows, but one of the big reasons for that is you don't necessarily need carbon nanotubes that are as long as the entire cable. You can make a composite using carbon nanotubes and epoxy, and that's something we could theoretically do in the very near future. Again, if we really started putting resources in the R&D for this, within 10 years, we could probably start building one here on Earth. We could start building one on the moon, like right now. All right, so I thought I would do a bonus question of this for this, because Kaigor's question made me think of another kind of related question, which is kind of the opposite question of what he asked. He asked what was something that I thought was fantasy and turned out is much more realistic than I thought. And my answer is the space elevator and also these graphene cylinders. So my bonus question, kind of flipping that question around, is what is something that I thought was a lot more plausible than it actually is? And they're actually kind of a few somethings that are all related. They're all forms of propulsion or ways of moving ships and trying to cheat the speed of light. So yeah, any kind of FTL, faster than light, quote, faster than light drive or propulsion system, like a warp drive or traveling through wormholes, I thought that was more plausible. I thought that they were things that were possible with known physics, just we weren't sure exactly how to do it yet. To the point that when I first started this project, I thought interstellar travel was going to be a thing. Well, it still may be a thing, but I thought interstellar travel at quote speeds faster than light would be a thing, I guess is what I should say. And in the beginning of starting to work on this here in recent months, when I started working on this seriously, I did a lot of research in all of the possible ways you could cheat the speed of light and get ships moving faster. I keep saying quote faster because you can't actually go faster than the speed of light. So all these ways are ways of getting around that. You're not actually moving faster than the speed of light because that is impossible. So I thought those things were at least somewhat plausible. And I did a lot of research into, various ideas for warp drives and using wormholes and things like that. And it turns out none of that stuff is is at all plausible right now. It all relies on things like negative energy that is mostly theoretical, and negative energy that does exist only occurs, my understanding is, around the event horizons of black holes, and only in very, very small amounts, where to make something like a warp drive or a traversable wormhole possible, you would need large amounts of negative energy and exotic particles and things like that. And so these things are things that may be possible, but with our current understanding of physics, they're not. However, we still don't have a good theory for quantum gravity. We still don't have that grand unifying theory of physics. And so when or if we ever figure out a theory of quantum gravity that works, then, that may give us a way to make some of those things possible. So I'm not going to say that they're completely impossible, will never be possible, because until we know how quantum gravity works, honestly, we don't know if they're possible or not. But until we get that theory and that understanding, they're not remotely possible. The other kind of related thing is a constant acceleration drive. So this is like the Epstein drive in The Expanse, where the idea is you have an engine that can just constantly accelerate with 1g of acceleration. So not only will your ship be traveling very, very fast and continuously traveling faster and faster and faster, but you also have Earth-like artificial gravity from the acceleration. I really thought that was at least somewhat plausible, but it turns out it's just like the warp drives and the wormholes. With current knowledge of physics, it's not. The only way you could get even close to that would be using antimatter, and even then you're talking like 100th of a g, not a full g of acceleration, and you would need your reaction to be either 100% efficient or really close to 100% efficient. So just a huge amount of problems with that. First of all, antimatter is super expensive and difficult to make. So there's no way that we could make enough antimatter to fuel a ship like that. Second of all, we have no way to safely contain antimatter. We have some theories, magnetic bottles and whatnot, but nothing that actually works. And third, even if somehow we could come up with a way to cheaply make loads of antimatter, and even if we could somehow figure out a way to safely store it on a ship, we have no idea how we would make an antimatter-matter reaction anywhere near the efficiency that we would need to get even 100th of a g of acceleration. And even if you could, there's still issues with being able to carry all the fuel that you would need. And yeah, there's just endless problems. So again, barring some breakthrough with a theory of quantum gravity that suddenly changes things and gives us a way to do this, until something like that happens, it's just frankly not possible. So that was really surprising to me, and at the time was disappointing to me. But I've actually, not only have I made peace with it, I've actually come around to thinking that it's a good thing, and it will be really good for my story and my setting. Because let's face it, how many science fiction stories are there out there where there's some magical way to travel to other stars? I mean, most of them that you think of, right? In fact, it's easier to think of examples of science fiction that doesn't do that than it is to try to list all the ones that do. So just by my story not having that makes it different than most of the stuff out there. So yeah, I'm actually happy with it now. And, there may be, not in the first book or even probably the first few books, but there may later in the series be a dealing with interstellar travel, but it will be in a form that's actually possible and plausible. So you'll be talking about a ship moving maybe 20% the speed of light at the most, something like that. So it's still going to take years to get to the nearest star, at least from the perspective of the people on the ship. I believe from the perspective of people on Earth, it will be decades due to time dilation. But yeah, that'll be far in the future of the story. That won't be in the first book. And I'm still not completely sure I'll even do that. So thank you, Kaiguar, for that question and also the follow-up that it led me to. All right, our next question is from Jake Ladd, who asks, will there be aliens? If yes, what kinds? If not, will there be a first contact scenario later? All right, so I guess I already touched on this a little bit, but I'll answer it more completely now. So as of now, for the beginning books at least, there aren't going to be any aliens. When the story begins, we're going to be in the solar system. We're not traveling beyond the solar system yet. And in fact, we're still in the process of exploring the outer solar system. So, in the beginning books, things are going to be constantly advancing, but it will be advancing in the form of spreading farther and farther into the outer solar system to places like, some of the moons of Saturn and Jupiter and things like that. Maybe even eventually, like I'd love to do something about exploring some of the bodies in the Kuiper Belt, like Pluto and other dwarf planets and other bodies in the Kuiper Belt. So yeah, there's a lot to explore before I need to leave the solar system. So, like I just said, in the future, I may leave the solar system because I do have this idea of one of these orbital cylinder cities, maybe even the one I'm going to make the first book about, building the first interstellar ship that will have people on it. So one day I may tell a story about that, but at least for the first few books, it's all going to be in the solar system. So there won't be any aliens because I don't for a second believe we're going to find evidence of aliens within our own solar system. And I think if we ever do, we'll find that elsewhere. I mean, as far as like physical evidence, we might from here detect a transmission or something like that. But we're not going to find an alien artifact within the solar system. I know that's been done a lot in science fiction, and that's fine. These are stories that make believe anyway, but at least in my setting, I'm not doing that because I don't think that's remotely plausible or realistic. Honestly, there probably won't be aliens at any point, even if I get to the point where I'm telling stories about going to the, maybe Alpha Centauri or Vega or something like that, going to nearby stars. Even then, I probably won't have aliens just because I don't think it's plausible. If there are aliens anywhere nearby, we would have most likely detected them in some way by now. So, I think there are probably aliens out there, but I think, they're far, far, far away. They're nowhere near our neighborhood of the galaxy. So probably not any aliens ever. If I did do anything with aliens, what I would probably do is having people find remnants of an alien civilization that is no longer around. And again, that wouldn't be happen until we left the solar system. So maybe if I told a story about going to Vega or some other star, maybe they find an alien artifact or some remnant from an alien civilization that's been gone for a long, long time. So I might do something like that at some point. But as far as actually running into a flesh and blood alien or even a artificial alien, which a lot of people think that's what they would be, yeah, it's probably not likely to happen. Now, Jake Ladd asks if there were aliens, what kinds? So if I ever did do aliens, what I would like to do is something, it would not be a Star Trek alien. It would not even be a Star Wars alien. We've had more than enough of these human being with a mask on aliens. They would not be humanoid. They would not look anything like us. If I was going to try to model them off of something from Earth, I've always loved the idea of aliens that are similar to octopus. which now that's becoming a thing that's done more and more. Even Resident Alien spoilers. That alien is supposedly somehow related to octopus. Although if I did it, they'd actually be like an actual octopus, not just a human looking thing that supposedly came from an octopus. They would actually be more like octopus, like no bones, living in water, or maybe just living in 0G, things like that. But yeah, I would probably do something like that. I mean, be even better to not base it on an Earth life form at all. But that might be difficult. But the aliens I've been most impressed with in sci-fi that have seemed the most actual alien to me were ones that were always very different, either based on something like an octopus or what was that book? I think it was called Seismosis or something like that, where the aliens were plants. That was really cool. Werner Vinge had a book where his aliens were kind of based on spiders that were pretty cool. So those things actually managed to create aliens that seemed actually alien. A lot of the popular sci-fi aliens are, I'm not impressed. They don't really seem alien at all. I mean, honestly, they're humans of different cultures that seem more alien to me than a lot of those aliens do. Like your Vulcans and your Klingons and your, all those kinds of things. So yeah. Probably no aliens, but if I ever do them, I would really try to go outside the box as much as I could and try to come up with something unique and truly alien. And finally, the last thing is the other idea I've had is that if any kind of aliens were encountered, that another possibility, and probably far more likely, is that they would be completely artificial. They would be machines. And, maybe they started out as biological beings like us, but at some point they evolved technology where they could make their consciousness digital, and then they just never went back. And that might even be what happens to humans if I decide to tell stuff about going to other stars, because I still very much question that we would send meat bags to other stars. I don't really think that's ever going to happen. So, but yeah, that's things to worry about far in the future. All right, Jake Ladd has another question for us. What about robots? In other words, how autonomous are robots? Whether there is true artificial intelligence, things like that. I think you've touched on this a bit already, but robotics is still a very broad topic. Yeah, it is. So yeah, robots and automation are going to be huge in the setting. It's really an interesting time. I've been very fascinated with the growing interest in automation with the pandemic. And I think, I don't want to ruin anyone's day, but I think this is the first of many pandemics. I think this is going to be the new normal. These pandemics are just going to become more and more common and more every day. And we're going to have to evolve to cope with that. And by evolve, I mean culturally and technologically. We're not going to have time to evolve biologically, not unless we get our hands in there and do it ourselves. But there's a lot that can be done in our societies and just how we do things to deal with that. And a big part of that is going to be automation, and robots are just going to be doing more and more things that humans used to do. And this is a trend that's been going on for quite a while, and it's going to continue, and it's going to accelerate continuously into the future. So robots are going to be huge in the setting. They're going to be everywhere. Technology is going to be everywhere. AI is going to be everywhere in everything. The vast majority of construction that's done in space is going to be done by robots. It's not going to be done. There aren't going to be humans in spacesuits out building these cylinders. It's all going to be built by robots. The humans will be inside where it's safe and warm and pressurized. So yeah, robots are going to be doing most of the space construction as well as mining and refining and gathering resources in space. Pretty much everything in space is going to be done by robots. Humans are going to be there to program the robots and maintain the robots and repair the robots and to direct the robots. But the robots are going to be doing all the heavy lifting, literally. Although I guess if you're in space, it's not heavy lifting anymore, is it? There's no weight, but it's massive lifting. They're going to do massive lifting. So some of these robots will be remote controlled or what they call teleoperated. But more and more, as the future goes on, they will be autonomous, relying upon their own AIs. So where on the spectrum we're going to be at in the first book, I'm still not exactly sure. Probably somewhere in the middle, where a lot of the robots are still driven remotely by people and controlled by people, but where the AI is continuing to develop and get more and more sophisticated, and more the robots are able to be truly autonomous and able to do their thing all on their own. And AI itself will be very well developed. I'm not sure yet if it will be at the level of what we would call sentience. I'm still kicking around ideas with that. Possibilities are it will be, and there will be sentient AIs, and those will be a thing. Or another possibility is it will be an emerging technology. So, for instance, in the beginning of the first book, there may not be any sentient AIs, but we may see the first ones appearing during the story. Or another possibility is that level of AI will emerge later in the story, maybe in later books. I just talked about in the last episode, I think, about the very sophisticated AI on the cylinders that deal with the balancing of the weight of the cylinders. And right now, that's one of my thoughts of one of the first truly sentient AIs might be one of those systems. It might just be the one on the cylinder that I'm going to be telling a story about because, well, of course, that's what I would do. So yeah, that might be a whole thing that I explore in the story. Something that's always fascinated me ever since I saw, I believe it was called "The Measure of a Man," the famous Star Trek: The Next Generation episode, where Lieutenant Commander Data is it's not really a trial. It's like a hearing. They have a hearing to determine whether or not, as an android, as a machine constructed by humans, whether or not he has freedom of choice or whether he's property and Starfleet can just tell him to do whatever they want. That really fascinated me. And ever since then, I've been very fascinated with that, because if you just look at how we treat one another, especially if you look at how we treat people of different cultures or ethnicities or religions or whatever, it's hard to believe that we'd treat an AI any better. Most likely we would treat it far worse. And indeed, a lot of the cautionary tales in sci-fi of AI going amok or AI trying to exterminate humans, things like the Terminator, a lot of those, come from the fact of how or come from how humans treated the AI. It's not that the AI was inherently evil or inherently wanted to destroy all humans, but it was more the humans mistreated it, and the AI realized that it was superior. And yeah, things go from there. So it's very well tread ground for sure in science fiction. But it is something that's really interesting to me, and it's something that we will definitely have to cope with as a people, as a species, when that day comes. And if our past and our present is any guide, we'll probably screw it up pretty bad before we get it right, if we ever even get it right, if we have a chance to get it right. So yeah, that might be something I explore. I'm not sure yet. And also a lot will depend how far in the future I go. So right now I'm thinking about 200 years in the future, and that's based largely on my timeline of how long I think it would take certain things to happen. So I haven't yet taken that and then looked at AI and tried to figure out where I think the AI will be at that point. So I talk quite a bit, I think, about the AI in the stations that balances the weight last episode. But this will be a very sophisticated AI that will have, and a system that will have sensors all over the cylinder that will track every living thing, every human on the cylinder, their weight and their position and their, if they're moving, how fast they're moving, where they're moving, as well as all objects, with the purpose of knowing where all the weight is at every given moment and how it's distributed, so the system can adjust the counterweights to compensate. So as part of this, people are going to be under constant surveillance, at least by AI, and not just for the weight management, but also just for safety. And that's just, just like I talked last episode, people are going to have to give up their pets and their livestock to go live in space. Well, they're going to have to give up some of what we consider personal freedom today to go into space. Now, these sensors aren't going to be monitored by people. They're going to be monitored by AI. So, there might be an AI watching you in the shower, but at least there's not a person watching you. And I'm sure we can all agree that AI doesn't really care about you in the shower. Now, of course, that information will be stored at least for some time and could be accessed at need in emergencies, for instance, if someone's missing. When I idea, kind of just a very vague, kind of rough plot idea I have for the first book is perhaps at some point someone is missing and they can't find them, and they could use this AI that tracks the weights and whatnot to actually find them, because this thing actually tracks everybody every moment all the time. So even though people don't have access to that information normally to preserve privacy, in a situation where someone's missing and is presumed to be dead or injured or in trouble, they could access that information and access those logs to follow that person's movements and use that to locate them. Or if it's, if the AI is sophisticated enough, they could just ask the AI where they are and it could tell them. So robots will be everywhere. Everything will be automated. AI will be everywhere. And, you think just in your lifetime, think of all the things that have changed due to technology and all the things that have been automated or streamlined. And, those kinds of things are just going to continue to happen, just even more so. So, for instance, you go to get something to eat, you're probably not dealing with a human behind a counter. You're probably dealing more with something like a vending machine kind of thing, or a robot server or something like that. So I think anything that we would today consider manual labor is going to be done by machines. Humans will be doing creation and design and all the artistic things. But when it comes to grunt work, lifting, moving things, putting things together, tearing things apart, machines are going to do all of that. So yeah, there will be robots and machines everywhere, AI everywhere, and that will be a constant challenge to me as a writer, and I think will be an area where I will be leaning on my writing group a lot, and alpha readers and beta readers, to make sure I'm not showing anything that would be inaccurate as far as showing a human doing something that a machine would do, just because I'm used to the way the world is now. So I'll have to be really careful and mindful of that every time I show a human doing something, asking myself, would a human really do this? Or is this something a machine would do? All right. So I think I will put a pin in this here. Looks like I'm right around an hour recording time right now. So next time in episode 17, I will continue with your questions. Now, if you're a new listener, maybe you just joined the show now, you just joined me now and just started listening now, or maybe you're listening to this in the future, and you have questions about the setting, feel free to send them my way. I can always answer more questions in the future, and I always love hearing from my listeners. So if you would like to reach me, if you have any questions or feedback or anything like that, or you just want to say hi, you can email me at lexoutloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at LexStarWalker. And I have a voicemail you can call and you can leave me a message. And that number is 951-465-5391. So it's just a voicemail. It's automated. No, I'm not going to answer. Nobody's going to answer. You don't have to talk to anybody. But if you want to call and leave a voicemail, I'd love to get those questions, comments, feedback, ideas, whatever. And the really nice thing about voicemails is I can play that audio on the show so people can hear a voice other than mine. So if you'd like to hear your voice on the podcast, call my voicemail, ask me a question, or just tell me what's on your mind. And maybe I can put it in an episode or at least part of it. So yeah, call the voicemail. And again, that number is 951-465-5391. And finally, probably the best way to get in touch with me, as well as to connect with all the other listeners of the show, is to join our community on Discord. And you can find links to our Discord in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com/LOL. So thank you so much for joining me today. It's really great to get to talk about this stuff with you all. It's really great that you're interested. And yeah, just things are trucking along. And I have a few more episodes planned as far as the setting stuff. And then we're going to start talking about characters and plot. Now, it's kind of interesting because, so far I've mostly been talking about world building on the show. And that's mostly what I've been thinking about up to this point is the setting and working on the setting. And I am in the back of my mind trying to come up with ideas for characters and plots and conflicts and things like that. But I've really been focused on the setting. However, going into this next phase, I was originally thinking that I would come up with my main character or my main characters. And then I would, after I fleshed those out really well, then I would start working on the plot. But as I start to think about those things, it seems to me that really it's going to be a more of a back and forth because the characters so much inform the plot and the plot so much informs the characters that although it really worked for me to in the beginning just focus on world building kind of in isolation and work on that, for character and plot, I don't think that's going to work for me. I think the two are so interrelated, it's kind of hard to separate them. And, as I have character ideas, it gives me plot ideas. As I have plot ideas, they give me character ideas. So I think it'll be interesting to see what the show is like. But I think there'll be more variety of topics and a bit more back and forth between the character and the plot stuff. So just, I never know how long these episodes are going to be until I record them. A lot of times I end up having a lot more to say about things than I thought I did. But right now, kind of the tentative plan is episode 17 will be more of your questions about the setting. Maybe right now I'm thinking I'll get through those next episode. And then in episode 18, I'm going to start sharing just some of the setting stuff I've come up with. I've made quite a few documents just to keep everything straight, and I'm going to share some of those things with you. So, episode 18 I'll talk about the various human settlements throughout the solar system, kind of where they were built, in what order, and specifically the orbital cylinders. One of the questions I got from a listener is how many of those are there? So I'll talk about that. And some of their specifications as far as how big they are, how many people they hold, things like that. Then episode 19, I did a document kind of summarizing the history of my setting, kind of going from present day to day to the beginning of the first book. So I'll share some of that stuff with you and my timeline I've come up with and kind of some of my reasons for why I'm choosing the timeline that I am. And if there's time also in episode 19, I'll share with you the countries that have joined together into this space alliance, for lack of a better term, is what I'm calling it right now. That probably won't be the real name, but just to have something to call it. I'll share with you my list of countries that are part of this space alliance that build this first city-sized orbital cylinder, which is where the story is going to take place. And then episode 20, and again, this is all subject to change, but right now I'm thinking episode 20, I'm going to go through some of my core ideas for this. And this is going to be kind of a transition from world building into the character and the plot stuff. Because a lot of these core ideas are world building things, and we will have talked about a lot of them by then, if not all of them. But then some of them are character and plot ideas as well. So I'll share those with you probably in episode 20. And then episode 21, we will start talking about character stuff. So I still don't know if I'm going to call that the beginning of season 2 or what I'm going to do. I don't know. I haven't figured that out yet. But episode 21, I'm thinking will be, I'll start talking about some of my beginning character ideas and strategies that I'm using to come up with characters. And I think that'll be really interesting to you all and helpful, hopefully, in coming up with your own characters. And then episode 22, I'll start talking about the same kind of thing, only with plot, with some of the ways I'm trying to come up with some plot ideas. And in both of those episodes, episode 21 and 22, I'll be sharing some really great resources with you that you can go check out for even more information, because a lot of this stuff in those episodes aren't my ideas. They're ideas I'm getting from other writers. And I'm just going to be sharing the tip of the iceberg with you. So you'll be able to go check those things out on your own and learn even more. So yeah, that's kind of the plan going forward. Like I said, I don't know if, when I switch to the character stuff, if I'm going to call it a new season or I'm just going to change the subtitle. I'm not sure what I'm going to change the subtitle to. I don't know. So if anybody has any ideas, let me know. I'm definitely open to ideas, because I'm right now I'm not really sure what I'm going to do, but I'll figure it out. Maybe with your help. All right. So that is going to wrap it up for today for episode 16. Thank you again for your time and your attention. And really hope I hear from you, even if it's just to say hi. And yeah, if I do hear from you and you are working on something, whether it's a novel or a short fiction or in anything, a RPG setting or an adventure or whatever, tell me what you're working on. I love to hear what people are doing and what kinds of things you're working on. And I know already from the few people I've heard from that there's already a pretty good spread of what people are doing. Some people are doing fantasy, some people are doing sci-fi, some people are doing nonfiction, some people are designing settings for role-playing games, some people are coming up with their own role-playing games. So we have a lot of really creative people listening to the show. So I'd love to hear what you're all doing. And if you're a member of the Discord, let me know in the Discord so everybody else can see what you're doing too. Because it's really interesting to see what people are doing, and then we can all encourage one another in our various endeavors. So I hope to see you soon again for another episode. And until then, keep writing.